Welcome to the Why on Earth Communities Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series. Today, I'm so excited that we have visiting with us Brian Czech. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Aaron. Yep.
Brian is an ecological economist and is the executive director of the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, also known as CASSE. Brian spent nearly 20 years at the United States Fish and Wildlife Service headquarters before resigning in 2017 to run CASSE. His books include Supply Shock, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, and the Endangered Species Act, History, Conservation Biology, and Public Policy. Brian has a PhD from the University of Arizona and is a leading figure in ecological economics. I would like to also note that he was the first conservation biologist ever hired by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that CASSE has been awarded the Eco Champion Award by Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, known as PEER, for their work in the arena of limits to growth and ecological carrying capacity and integrity here on Earth. And Brian, I'm so thrilled we have the opportunity to speak together today, and I think it's just hilarious. Here we are at a park. We happen to meet up in Aspen. We're both traveling through the high mountains of Colorado. It's been raining for, 20-25 minutes or something, and we are under a beautiful blue spruce, which has more or less shielded all the rain from us.
Yeah, more or less.
So here we are, and welcome, Brian, and thank you for taking the time to visit with us.
Thank you. Thanks.
So why don't you kick us off, framing the conversation? What is all this about? What is the issue when we're talking about a steady state economy versus a perpetually growing economy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it always helps to remind people what economic growth is. It's simply increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate.
Yeah.
And so that means a growing human population and or per capita production and consumption, and it's measured with GDP. And
that's an acronym. It stands for
gross domestic product.
Okay. Yeah.
And we sometimes call it gross domestic problem.
Gross domestic
because
problem.
it's beginning to cause more problems than it solves.
Yeah.
There are, of course, tremendous benefits to economic production, but there are, at this stage in human history, tremendous impacts. And any environmental impact, it's not just a tree hugger issue. The environment is the foundation of the economy. So we say that there is a fundamental conflict. Fundamental because it can't be gotten out of with just technological progress, for example.
Yes.
A fundamental conflict between economic growth and four categories of things: environmental protection, economic sustainability, national security, and international stability. More or less in that order. Although you might say, well, it's the international stability that comes before the national security, because international instability is such a great threat as well to national security.
It's so interesting. You know, I have been struck working in and around the field of economics as it relates to environmental sustainability, and that it has been the militaries, by and large, the intelligence community, and the reinsurance industries who were most advanced in understanding some of these major systemic risks that we have been facing out, several decades, creeping a bit closer now, and that these issues of international stability, national security are so intimately linked with environmental protection and economic sustainability from a policy standpoint. It seems, golly, some of our I don't want to use the term knucklehead on a recording like this, but some of our friends and colleagues in Congress and inside DC could do a little better in understanding some of these connections.
Yeah, you
And
hope.
there really is. We live in a giant ecology, planet Earth.
Hmm.
It's a contained and limited system, a beautiful one, and we share it with all our other human brothers and sisters all around the planet.
Hmm.
So I just am so struck that getting into a conversation around economics and the assumptions that we're working with in our culture when it comes to economics, there's a lot there that needs to be looked at and examined.
Yeah, for sure. And the part about limits to growth, I mean, that shouldn't be that, it's not rocket science that you can't have a perpetually growing economy. I mean, what are we going to have? A trillion, quadrillion, gazillion GDP? When we think in these ridiculous terms, that's when we usually start to get some buy-in, even from conventional economists that, well, yeah, sure, there probably are limits to growth, but they're so far out there that why should we even bother thinking about that now? But that's a whole different discussion all of a sudden than whether or not there is a limit to economic growth.
Yeah.
Once we all agree that, yeah, of course, you can't have a perpetually growing economy, then the question is, well, where should we stop that growth of the economy? When is it starting to cause more problems than it solves?
Yeah.
And a lot of us, that love the wide open spaces and big trees and wildlife and solitude, we think it's already post-optimum. The economy is already too big for optimum conditions on the earth. And I think there's a lot of people are starting to agree with this.
Yeah.
It's not just the natural world now, it's creeping into our economies. It's harder and harder to maintain this level of economic activity in the U.S. and on the globe. Yeah. And it is very, tightly connected with international stability and national security, not only from the pressures caused by international instability, but the need for economic sustainability to maintain, for example, a military,
Right.
much less a healthy society.
So I'm struck that we'll be on this episode talking a bit about different aspects of the economics, and I forget who said it, but somebody called economics the dismal science.
Right.
I know for sure it's not every one of our favorite subjects, but nonetheless, I think it really is important for us as citizens, as voters, as participants in this momentous time in the human story, that we have some working understanding of some of these economic principles. And with that in mind, I'm hoping, we're talking about some debates that have been going on for decades, even a couple centuries, going back to the late 1800s, the Enlightenment period. We had the Scottish Enlightenment, most famous among them being probably Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of Nations, published 1776. And across the water there, we had the French physiocrats, very focused on the natural foundation of economic production and activity. And I was hoping you could walk through, when we're talking about primary, secondary, tertiary, all these steps and kind of what's going on in that broader economic picture. Just walk us through how we understand that to be working. It would be helpful, I'm sure, for many in our audience.
Yeah, well, in ecological economics, we call that the trophic structure of the economy. So if we start with the economy of nature, which both Francois Quesnay and the physiocrats and Adam Smith had a pretty good grasp of, they were Renaissance men. They understood the bigger picture of the world. They knew a lot about agricultural production and how the natural world worked and how that linked into economic activity.
Yeah.
So in the economy of nature, you have at the base of that, the producers, the plants, and they're called producers because they produce their own food via the process of photosynthesis.
Yes.
And then what eats the plants, those are primary consumers. And then what consumes, the primary consumers are secondary consumers, like predators.
Uh-huh.
So that's the very basics of the structure of the economy of nature.
Yeah.
And and there are service providers too, like decomposers and scavengers and pollinators. So humans come along, evolve, and were created. They're there now, and they're part of this economy of nature, and they're at the pinnacle of this trophic structure. For one thing,
Yeah.
they can eat anything else out there that's edible, and they also have to follow the same basic rules of the game. They have a trophic structure in their economy.
Uh-huh.
They're like a subset of that broader economy of nature. And if you take this subset out and analyze it, it has its trophic structure. So it starts with the agricultural and extractive sectors. Those are the producers.
That would be like forestry, fishing,
Yeah.
mining,
Correct.
these kinds of taking from Earth and Earth's productivity directly.
Exactly.
Okay.
Directly. And then built upon that, you have the manufacturing sectors, and those are the basic trophic levels. The heavy manufacturing, like iron ore refining, all the way up to the lightest sectors like computer chip manufacturing.
Yeah, folks making cell phones and all that kind of business.
And mixed all throughout that are service sectors, just like in the economy of nature.
Uh-huh.
And so it's actually a good way to view the fundamental conflict between economic growth and environmental protection.
Yeah.
Because as that part of the economy of nature continues to expand, it's like a trophic compression of all the other species below in the broader economy of nature. So when you look at the list of species that are endangered, this burgeoning list of threatened and endangered species, and you look at the causes of their endangerment, it's like a who's who of the American economy.
Right.
Just this and that sector, one after another, that is what's pushed, that's what is liquidating the habitats that species require to make a living in. And same thing with animal and plant species being squeezed out by that growth of the human economy.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly living in precarious times, and I just heard recently that at the time approximately of, I want to say, President Franklin Roosevelt, was it? Or maybe it was Teddy Roosevelt. There were about 2 billion people on the planet. And now, just over 100 years, or about 100 years later, we have about 7.5 billion people on the planet. And many of my friends working in the realm of social justice, as it relates especially to the environmental issues that we're concerned with, point out that some of the population discussion or debate is very loaded with social justice issues and really ethical issues, and issues that require us to look at our human decency and matters of dignity and matters of the heart, if you will. But that all aside for just a moment, just looking purely at the numbers of growing from something like 2 billion to almost 4 times as much within just a few generations, that's obviously a pattern you don't want to see perpetuating or continuing for too many more generations in this situation.
It should be obvious, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
India alone has 1 billion people.
Yeah.
And people that are that do not consume as wastefully on a per capita basis as they do in the U.S., for example.
Right.
And nevertheless, you can already see the signs of resource shortage. Much of Tamil Nadu in southern India is without water.
Yeah.
It's a perilous existence in cities like Chennai. Huge cities in southern India, and there's no end in sight. The it's not only climate change, it's the use of the water resources there.
Yep.
And water is the lifeblood of the economy. I mean, some people might say it's oil. Well, okay, you know, it's lifeblood, the energy, the calories required. One's oil, one's water. They're both required for this level of economic activity. You know, an $82 trillion global economy right now. So the economy, once again, going back to the earliest minutes of this, it's population times per capita production and consumption.
Yep.
Either one's too high, gets to be too much for
Yep.
the planet and the future economy.
Yeah, I have to point out, or I know a few of my friends will give me a hard time afterward. With respect to the water and the oil piece, so many folks now are working on solutions to transition from oil. Clearly, there are a whole number of reasons why that's worthwhile and thankfully underway. Water, on the other hand, there's no substitute for water. Water is life. Our bodies obviously are composed of it, 70% or better, same as the surface of the planet itself, interestingly. And so clearly when we're now confronted with situations around the planet where more and more of us do not have access to water, that ought to be on its face enough for us to be thinking about these economic issues, hands down.
Absolutely, and I think that although it seems like economic growth is so ensconced as
Yes.
the primary policy goal around the world, you can see the cracks in that firmament, if you will, in a lot of countries now, in a lot of parts of the world. Bhutan moving to the pursuit of gross national happiness,
Yes.
because they see all the unhappiness around the world associated with pulling out all the stops for GDP growth.
Right.
And even before that, the Thailand's idea of the sufficiency economy, rather than more and more every year.
Yeah.
There are precedents for this, and it's the logical way to go. It's the ethical way to go, and it's the diplomatic way to go. I mean, when we call for a steady state economy in the U.S., obviously that's not sufficient for global sustainability. So we have a vision for steady statesmanship, we like to call it, in international diplomacy. We have to figure out where are the biggest problems in terms of the per capita consumption, where's the most wasteful consumption, and where are populations burgeoning so rapidly that the rest of the world can't absorb those rates of immigration.
Yep.
Both of these things have to really be wrestled with seriously in international diplomacy.
Yeah.
Growth is not the answer. Growth
Right.
is just compounding both of those two problems.
Yes, absolutely. Hey, I love the discussion around the gross national happiness work that's being done in Bhutan. And I imagine some of our audience may not be familiar. Is that something you could tell us a little more about?
A little more, yeah. Bhutan was a kingdom
Yeah.
as little as 7 years ago, maybe, and the king of Bhutan did look around and had become familiar with some of the principles of ecological economics. I think he was familiarized partially through the Convention on Biological Diversity that heads of state attended, and there's sort of a bit of a common sense out there now around the world that there's serious environmental problems, and that is such a spectacularly beautiful country, and the people from Bhutan are proud of that. If you meet the people from there, they are happy. How couldn't you be in such a spectacular place? And so they want to keep it that way.
Yeah.
They look out at what they have, and they don't want that to change dramatically. They don't want bulldozers coming in and skyscrapers messing that up. So he said to the people, GDP is not what we're after. We're after gross national happiness. And concurrently with that, as you know, he moved that government into a ministerial government. So that's kind of a very nice sequence of events, both what we might call steady statesmanship corresponding with a more democratic form of government. It's
Absolutely
really nice.
beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I just want to make a quick note before it slips my mind. And that reminds me of something we were discussing earlier, which is often the activities we can engage in on a day-to-day basis that are most conducive to our health, our well-being, our high quality of life are activities where we're not buying and consuming. Here we are under a blue spruce. It's been raining a while. We've been standing here a while. It's been absolutely delightful. We're getting so much benefit in the fresh air and
I wish it was
trees,
throwing off a little more heat.
a little more heat. But
it has sheltered us.
Here we are, and we're not spending money to be right here.
Yeah, good point. Because money originates, with that agricultural and extractive activity at the base. That goes back to the trophic structure of the economy. And when it comes to monetary matters, we call that, we call it the trophic theory of money, because money does originate via the agricultural surplus, especially, that frees the hands for the division of labor into all these different activities, economic activities. But a lot of the pleasures of life, like the folks that just came around walking the dog with the little grandkid and stuff, that didn't cost anything, and it's not, nobody's paying for that or extracting resources in any. They obviously, somebody had to make a living to feed the family. There's the base level. Nobody's saying don't have any economic activity. It's a matter of how much.
The appropriate levels.
Appropriate levels.
Well, I'm really struck about the fact that you're doing a whole lot of work at the policy level, working with lawmakers, etc. And I want to make sure we get to that in a couple minutes.
Okay.
But of course, with the Y on Earth community, we also, in addition to our civic work and conversations with policymakers, etc., we are also very focused on what can we do in our day-to-day lives, folks from all sorts of backgrounds. And one of the things you mentioned earlier to me before we started the recording that really stuck is your emphasis on spending less, simply spending less.
Certainly. When we were just talking about how more money, the supply of money and the flow of money. Money supplies like the M0, the M1, the liquid types of money supplies, and flows of money like GDP. These are outstanding indicators of environmental impact.
Right.
At this point in history, GDP is probably a better indicator of environmental impact than it is of any kind of well-being.
Absolutely.
And so spending less, that entails a little less of that economic activity. Why purchase something that's already provided by nature? We didn't have to go out and buy a tent. That would have required more surplus at that economic base. There's already a tree here we can stand under. There's examples just one after another in the course of a day of a human life.
It's
this one will seem maybe kind of corny, but when you wash your hands, you don't necessarily have to pull out a paper towel or run some electric dryer. Think about the 300 some million people in the country that are doing that several times a day. That stuff really adds up.
It really does. It absolutely does.
Paper cups, straws, all of that. Well, you're getting me rolling now. Sorry,
good.
but I have to say it. I can't stand those Hummers.
Uh-huh.
You know, and thank goodness the Hummer demand seems to have abated. But for a while, Hummers were all the rage, and you know, during the Gulf Wars. Besides, what a
Yeah.
horrible symbolism that was, and what a
Yeah.
awful example of conspicuous consumption that is not only unsustainable, but in a way, it alone was a threat to national security, because it makes Americans, or whichever country is, you know, behaving like that,
Yeah.
makes us look bad.
Truly.
Makes us look like greedy pigs.
Truly.
And then, you know, and then we want to shut down the borders from people that have orders of magnitude less.
Yeah.
Those two things combined look really bad.
Right. We're not looking like good citizens in the neighborhood
Exactly.
in this way.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yep. You know, it reminds me too, you know, when we're taking a walk, say, or just having a nice chat in the park with somebody for a couple hours, we're not contributing to GDP at that point. However, if in a scenario, say I was walking down the street, I got hit by a car, an ambulance had to come get me, take me to a hospital. Meanwhile, I got news perhaps I was about to get a divorce or something. I'm not actually married, but you know, and had to get some lawyers in the mix, this, that, and the other. You know, I could have all of these really terrible things happening to me, but guess what? Those are all positive contributors to GDP.
Well, good thing you didn't get hit by a Hummer.
Oh yeah, that'd be even worse.
Just the worst of all worlds.
But I think it just illustrates that for a lot of us, maybe who we haven't thought about this quite as much, GDP is not at all an indicator as to quality of life, as to how well things are going.
Right. You know, to be fair to conventional economics and conventional economists, in countries with truly widespread poverty,
Yes.
you know, then GDP per capita is a useful metric.
Right.
But, you know, you can't get carried away. It's not the only metric because of examples like the ones you just mentioned. But certainly in a country where the vast majority is reasonably well fed and sheltered and far beyond that, frankly, then the GDP per capita is causing just as many problems as it's solving in human health and social life and political life. It's that's why, you know, way back in the 1860s, John Stuart Mill, you're probably very familiar with, was calling already for what he called a stationary state, which had nothing to do with a stagnating economy or society. You know, in a steady state economy, there's plenty of room for technological replacement, for consumer preferences to shift, for all kinds of economic dynamism, dynamic changes in the economy. It's just the size of that thing that is what matters in terms of sustainability. That's what matters the most. And so John Stuart Mill recognized that way back in the 1860s in England and said, you know, why don't we focus more on quality of life outside of this economic activity, you know, political life and civil life and civil rights and reforms and, you know, improving child education, and you know, all the other things that oftentimes are actually competed for by, you know, regular economic activities that are included in GDP calculations.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love if we could share a little bit about the CASI position on economic growth. And I want to mention that, folks, if you'd like to learn more, and you can actually, there's a great, really quick video at steadystate.org. And on there you can also check out, and if you would like to, you can become a signer of the CASI position on economic growth. by the way, there are already 14,000 signatories, and 215 organizations as well have endorsed this. So you can see here, it's kind of a full page, which is a summary of something that's fairly complex. But I thought it might be nice to read a few of the highlights, if that sounds good, Brian.
Yeah, nice.
And you want me to go for it, or you want to do it?
Oh,
okay.
Go for it.
So it says, whereas economic growth, as defined in standard economics textbooks, is an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services. Based upon established principles of physics and ecology, there is a limit to economic growth. Therefore, we take the position that there is a fundamental conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. For example, biodiversity conservation, clean air and water, atmospheric stability, and a steady state economy, that is, an economy with a relatively stable, mildly fluctuating production of population and per capita consumption, is a viable alternative to a growing economy and has become a more appropriate goal in large, wealthy economies. And for many nations with widespread poverty, increasing per capita consumption, or alternatively more equitable distributions of wealth, remains an appropriate goal. So what I love about this framework is that it's speaking to and encompassing a lot of complexity, but specifically is calling out that there are different appropriate courses for the wealthy, more developed nations versus the poorest economies around the world, and I really appreciate that it recognizes that subtlety.
Yeah, we had to, or it makes ethical sense, and it makes political sense, frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you showed that to them, but the Cassie position has 16 sentences, and so
Yeah.
Aaron just read like 5 that kind of summarize this thing that's already a summary of a complex issue.
Yep. So you too can sign on to this, along with some very notable thought leaders like E.O. Wilson, Jane Goodall, Vandana Shiva, David Suzuki, Chris Matthews, right? So some folks who have also given this a whole lot of thought have signed on and are considering this a very worthwhile cause.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian, I thought it would be good to also discuss, when we're talking with our Congress people, lawmakers, etc., what are some of the key points, and in what ways do we best frame this discussion for them?
Well, right now we have a president, Trump, who is obsessed with GDP growth. And so if you're a Democrat and you're going to visit, a Democratic representative or senator, why not tell them, look, Trump's got this argument that he's such a success because that GDP growth rate is so high. But look at all the stops he's pulling out for that. He's trashing the environmental regulations of the country, our standing in international diplomacy. He's pulling us out of crucial international agreements. He's all over with the tariffs. And when I say we, I'm an independent personally, politically, because both parties are still so pro-growth. But what a Democrat can do is, like we did with Cory Booker. We went into Cory Booker's office, met with staff, and said, given Trump's argument, why not take some baby steps away from condoning GDP growth?
Okay.
Just at least baby steps.
Yeah.
And so you may have heard Cory Booker has said things lately like, GDP doesn't speak to my constituents. That's a baby step. And it's key, because once there's one by one politician on the Hill, there will be other, leapfrogging steps by other politicians on the Hill, especially with a prominent one, a presidential candidate like that. So that's one thing we suggest. Ask your representative to take some baby steps, with rhetorical baby steps to get the idea out there in the public and in the polity with all the policymakers that GDP isn't everything.
Yeah.
And then it won't take long to point out that it really is a gross domestic problem as well as its gross domestic product. And the concept that there is such a thing as post-optimal growth that's causing more harm than good, that will start to percolate, and that's steady statesmanship. If this is growth that's unsustainable, well, that would be unsustainable. Degrowth. What's the sustainable alternative? It's this thing in between. That's the steady state economy.
It's a middle path. I like that.
Yeah, the middle path.
And what about those of us who would be speaking with Republican members of Congress? What advice do you have on that side?
Well, so we feel at Cassie that we have a latent connection with rural communities, in particular farmers and hunters and fishermen. They're the first ones that see the detriments of an overgrown economy. The green space is gone. The taxes are getting so intense it's hard to maintain a farm anymore or a ranch. The hunting grounds aren't there anymore. Every place is posted. So we think that some of our most natural allies are actually Republicans.
Yeah.
They call themselves conservatives.
Yeah.
Well, we say we're the true conservatives.
Love it.
Conservation is a steady state economy.
This is like in the tradition of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah,
right?
In the tradition of TR. That's right.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt set aside all these national wildlife refuges and national forests, and what those are you think of a national wildlife refuge. What's it a refuge from? It's a refuge from the economy.
That's right.
You put those signs out and you protect that from the bulldozers and even from too much outdoor recreation.
Sure.
You can't have too much of any economic activity. But the main thing is, the economy in the aggregate, all the sectors added up.
Yeah, that's really great, Brian. Oh, go
ahead.
Can
I add something?
Please, yeah, please.
So, that's a real general thing you can tell your politician. We have embarked on a long-term legislative project at Cassie, and that's to amend the Employment Act, which is the central macroeconomic policy of the United States. And after the 1978 amendments, it was called the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act. So Congress got the government not only into economic stabilization, but into growth as a formal policy goal. And it's reflected all over in fiscal and monetary policy and trade policy too. So what we are rewriting the Employment Act to what we call the Full and Sustainable Employment Act. And it starts with a preamble that Congress finds and declares that there is a limit to economic growth, and that economic growth is causing many profound problems in the USA and in the world. And we are therefore setting as a goal, a long-term goal, a sustainable, steady state economy. And then the rest of the act is going to be about the programs and procedures for transitioning from a growth economy to the steady state. And nobody, there's not going to be any brakes that are slammed on so that overnight a steady state economy happens. There will be decades of adjustments in monetary policy, in the banking system, and in fiscal policy, in the tax code, and in the budgets, federal and state and local budgets, and planning and zoning policies. But certainly, there's got to be some leadership at the federal level. And meanwhile, there's a lot of opportunity at local levels. So we have another campaign we're just starting called Keep Our Counties Great campaign.
I love it.
Because if you like what you see when you look out there, well, you want to keep it that way, and that is the steady state economy.
So how can we get involved and support and help all this work that you're doing?
Well, like you said before, start by visiting the website steadystate.org and sign the CASI position. That's sort of, as you might imagine, we're swimming straight upstream the river of political economy.
Yeah.
Big money doesn't want us around. They're certainly not going to donate to us.
Yeah.
So the only other thing that speaks as loudly as money to the politician is signatures.
Mm-hmm.
So these signatures really do matter. And of course, if you feel so compelled as to donate, obviously donations are going to help. We're one of the leanest nonprofits out there. We only have 2 at this time full-time employees and 2 part-time. And then we have a fairly robust internship program and volunteer program. We have CASI chapters around the world. Join a CASI chapter, become a chapter director if you feel like you want to provide some leadership in this. Read up more on the topic. We have resources at the website, books and journal articles that'll provide you with the tools that you need, to be able to talk shop on steady state economics. What else can you do? Well, we already talked about spending less, of course.
Yeah.
But I would say start using the phrase, frankly, steady state economy, because there's too much lack of clarity out there right now about what the alternatives are.
Hashtag steady state.
Yeah,
Cool.
hashtag steady state.
Cool, I dig it.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian, let me just remind our audience that this is the Y on Earth Community's Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series, and today we are speaking with Brian Czech, the Executive Director of CASI, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. I want to be sure to give a shout out to our sponsors making this podcast possible. And all the work that we're doing around the country with community mobilization efforts. That includes Patagonia, Waylay Waters, the International Society of Sustainability Professionals, Purium, Earth Coast Productions, the Lidge Family Foundation, and the Association of Waldorf Schools of North America, ASNA. So thanks to all of you for your support, and a huge thank you to each of you individuals who have already signed up for our monthly giving program. This is such an important way to support the work we're doing at the Y on Earth community, and already have had so many great folks join in this effort. If you would like to join, please go to yonearth.org. That's the letter Y, onearth.org, and you can sign up at any level that works well for you. When you do, we'll be sure to send you a code for a free download of any of the ebook and audiobook resources that you would like to have in your collection. Now, also a very special gift for our CASI friends. Anyone in the CASI network and membership can use the code CASSE, that's CASSE, at yonearth.org to get 50% discounts on all of the ebook and audiobook resources. So just another way to thank you and all of your network for all the work you all are doing.
Thank you.
And Brian, it's just been a pleasure to have this opportunity to connect with you. I think it's so fun. We were both traveling through the mountains and we were able to link up here. Yeah. And lo and behold, it has stopped raining. The sun is shining. Before we sign off, I just want to make sure, is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
Well, it might be a little too detailed, but you mentioned the schools.
Yeah.
That's another resource we have available. We have K-12 curriculum
fabulous.
available.
Great.
Yeah, we had a grant from the Whedon Foundation to produce this curriculum. We have a limits to growth game for grades 1 through 3 as part of that. But I just noticed that was something I forgot to add when you asked, what else people might do. But I just want to say thank you also. I think anybody that's listening to your podcasts, by their nature, are kind of the ultimate solution to these problems. I mean, I think sustainability is a steady state economy, but there are all types of expertise required to get us into that place. So thank you, audience, and thanks, Aaron, for having me on here.
Hey, thank you, Brian. It's been great.
Okay.
Look forward to collaborating more with you too, by the way.
Me too.
As we get going.
Me too.
All right. See you later. Bye, everybody.